So welcome to this session of the Arctic Summer College, which has been pre-recorded. My name is Max Grünig from the Ecologic Institute, and I'll be talking today to Danita Burke, who was so kind as to join us from her summer school herself, which is on a different topic, however, and she'll be gladly answering some of our questions and talk a little bit about her research and knowledge in the field of Arctic sustainability. Welcome, Danita, to today's session. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
So first,
pleasure to be here.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, and I'm glad you were able to squeeze this in on such short notice. Let me ask you to tell us a little bit more about who you are and your background, and maybe also what always is interesting for participants. What drove you to study Arctic sustainability and what drove you to research this further? Was there a moment, a decisive moment, or was that more an evolutionary process?
No problem. Well, as you say, my name is Danita Catherine Burke. I am a fellow, a Marie Curie individual fellow based at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm originally from Newfoundland, Newfoundland, Canada, where I also did my undergraduate and graduate studies in political science. And then I went to the United Kingdom. I did a PhD in international politics at the Department of International Politics in Aberystwyth University in Wales, which is where I currently am on a Welsh immersion course, as you had mentioned. So what my research is that my research has typically focused on issues of international relations pertaining to the Arctic region. And I have touched upon various topics such as national identity, diplomacy, international non-governmental organizations, and ultimately, what really drew me to this subject is that growing up in Newfoundland, I had always had a rather proud sense of being a Newfoundlander and being someone from a northern nation. And I found the imagery that was often used to portray ideas of who Canada is and what they represent to be quite malleable and quite linked to ideas of the Arctic region. And ultimately, growing up with this type of environment really inspired me to further it in my studies. And so throughout my studies, I have studied various aspects of the Arctic region. And ultimately now I am into doing research on more sustainable development and international relations and cooperation dynamics. And that's really has been an evolutionary process over the past 13, 14 years for me.
Wonderful. Thank you for this introduction. And I think it gives everybody kind of a good impression of, one, the personal link you have with the Arctic, but then also how this evolved as a professional or scientific field for you. Now, I know that's a general question to ask that way, and you probably cannot answer this in all regards, but since you study several perspectives of Arctic studies and Arctic research, of course, our key interest in the Arctic Summer College being on Arctic sustainability, I wanted to ask you from your own experience whether you think that we have a good understanding of what the changing environment means and is in the Arctic today. Do we have a good picture, or do we have a lot of knowledge gaps? What's your impression?
Ultimately, I think that with the Arctic region, as its emergence into international politics is a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of the current wave of interest and the drivers behind it, that we have a combination of knowledge and knowledge gaps, as is inevitably the case in most big and new endeavors. We have a lot of knowledge that we can draw on from traditional and local knowledge from people who have lived throughout the Arctic region in the various Arctic countries. We have a growing body of scientific research as exemplified by the Arctic Resilience Report, and now with the emergence of the Arctic Council's agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation. But ultimately, the series of issues that are emerging and the changes that are happening in the Arctic region in the past 20 to 30 years as a result of climate change have really opened up different opportunities as well as challenges in the region, which we are grappling with and also seeking to find ways to work with for both the development of opportunities for people in the region, as well as sustainably developing various aspects of the region to benefit various people, both in the Arctic and outside of it.
So you mentioned traditional knowledge in your response right now, and I was wondering because we were supposed to hear more about it from a different speaker who had to cancel unfortunately last minute, but who was also working on the inclusion of traditional knowledge into the basically into scientific research. And I wonder, do you have an idea how this is done and how this is evolving? Because it's still something that seems to be relatively recent and still emerging from what I've heard.
In many respects, you're right. This is a relatively recent thing because it is a reflection of the changing place of indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic region within the governance of the region, and their changing place within their national political discourses in the various Arctic states. Some have more say than others because of various issues involving politics and devolution of powers. But ultimately, what we're finding is that there is a growing realization that traditional knowledge definitely has a place to play within the governance of the Arctic region. And I think that in the Arctic Council specifically, this has really been acknowledged. And this has been a growing process and certainly hasn't happened overnight. And a lot of credit has to go to indigenous peoples from the Arctic region who have pushed hard to have their voices heard and to have their local culture and knowledge base reflected within how the governance of the region is evolving.
Wonderful. So was that also part of your own research? And if so, how does that play into your own research? And in what way do you interact with traditional knowledge or indigenous populations' knowledge base?
Well, recently, before I started my present project looking at the incorporation of international non-governmental organizations within the Arctic Council and within the Arctic region governance, prior to that, I was doing a project which I've concluded under the support of the Carlsberg Foundation, in which I was looking at Arctic Council cooperation dynamics. And through a series of interviews with various diplomats, representatives from the different Arctic states and indigenous peoples to the Arctic Council, academics and research think tank individuals, I have been looking into how the dynamics of the Arctic Council had been working. And through that, I have noticed that traditional knowledge has come to play a more prominent role, as have the indigenous peoples' representatives within Arctic diplomacy. And to that extent, I have been engaging with traditional knowledge in my work.
Wonderful, thank you. That's very fascinating, and it made me wonder about a different aspect, because you were talking about the Arctic Council, which is, of course, a whole important organization that is science-oriented, so it's not necessarily a decision-making body, or it's not a governance entity, but still it made me think about one statement that I saw from you, was that the Arctic is not a global commons. And for that, maybe we need to explain also what you mean by global commons, because it might not be commonly known, if you forgive me for this pun. So maybe you could explain a little bit what you mean by this, and how you came to this position, and what that means also for maybe future work in the Arctic Council or in other fora.
Absolutely, no problem. So what you're referring to is short article I wrote for The Conversation, and in it I discussed some points of view and research that came out of the project I had previously mentioned that was supported by the Carlsberg Foundation on Arctic diplomacy. The global commons is essentially this, quite at a basic level, it's this idea that it's open for all and use for all. So the high seas, for example. And sometimes in discourse about the Arctic region, there is this conflation of the idea that the Arctic is a global commons with the fact that there are global commons areas in the Arctic region. So the Central Arctic Ocean area doesn't belong to any one Arctic state. It doesn't belong to any of them. It's high seas. One for dialogue and use and cooperation and, potential.
So I think you're breaking up. I'm really sorry. I didn't want to
You're referring to
come in here, but I think, Danita, the last sentences we could not clearly hear. What we heard was that the high seas are basically part of the global commons. The high seas are not territorial, but a lot of the Arctic is territorial. So
yes, it is. So the problem with this notion that the Arctic is a global commons is that it conflates an entire region with the notion that it's really the Central Arctic Ocean that is a global commons. Much of the Arctic region, all the land and much of the waters is within the national jurisdictions of the Arctic states, particularly the 5 coastal states, which are Russia, the United States, Canada, the Kingdom of Denmark, and Norway. So and there are some disputes between those states. For example, between the United States and Canada over in the Beaufort Sea. But that is a bilateral issue, and the outcome of it will not make this area that is under dispute in the Beaufort Sea a global commons. Therefore, there is a conflation sometimes with the idea that the Arctic is a global commons with the fact that there is an area within the Arctic region, which is the Central Arctic Ocean, which is because it's high seas.
Right. So thank you for clarifying this. And if you allow me to send a follow-up question on this. So if we think about maybe transboundary environmental pressures or threats in the Arctic region, be that pollution, be that maybe warming temperatures, be that potential threats from increased shipping traffic, all these areas, they are, of course, regulated in different ways, in different agreements. For example, in the Convention of the Law of the Seas, or in international agreements on certain pollutants, such as the UN Climate Framework Convention. However, my question is, and that's of course very, very personal question, but based on your research, is there a need, a gap for an additional specific Arctic agreement or Arctic convention that would go beyond what we already have in that sense? Or is that because what you mentioned, that the majority is actually bilateral and territorial, that this is actually more or less a matter that is not a need for future activity?
Well, I would clarify that by saying there's plenty of need for future activity, for cooperation, both between the Arctic states and with the international community as a whole, as issues happening in the Arctic region will, to varying degrees, affect other areas of the world. Just as pollution issues in other areas of the world will impact peoples in the Arctic region. There have been a number of moves towards cooperating in the Arctic region and in the polar regions, such as with the development of the Polar Code for helping to create a unified shipping regulations to help with both the sustainable development of shipping routes in the polar regions, as well as safety in the polar regions. And there has been, as was mentioned in the conversation article that you had referred to earlier about the global commons, there has been development between the Arctic coastal states, plus Iceland, and 4 other actors, including the European Union, China, Japan, and South Korea, to help develop a framework for the high seas region of the Arctic Ocean in order to help buy time for better research for the development of a better means of fisheries organization and management of the stocks there, as was reflected in some of the field work that I had done for my diplomacy project. There was a lot of reflection on the fact that in other areas of the world, because fish stocks don't monitor national boundaries, this has led to issues where, for example, being from Newfoundland, the nose and the tail of the Grand Banks lies outside of Canada's 200 nautical miles. And as a result, it has been subject to overfishing. And this has led to the collapse of the cod fishery. It certainly wasn't the only contributing factor, but it is a contributing factor. And so there has been keen interest by the various actors who are involved in this agreement to help create a temporary moratorium in the Arctic high seas in order to buy time to do better research in order to prevent another stock collapse of various fish stocks, so that way we don't have another tragedy of the commons in the Arctic region.
Yes, wonderful or very, very inspiring, and certainly it's good to have also positive examples. And I like it also how you point these out rather than just the problem areas. So that's very, very positive, and I think hopefully something that people here in the Arctic Summer College will study more about and hear more about. So you mentioned your diplomacy project a few times already, and it certainly is very, very exciting. I want to ask you one, maybe I would say maybe a little bit skeptical question, is that a lot of the Arctic nations have, of course, certainly have a part that is Arctic and a part that's not Arctic, or that's not entirely not entirely oriented towards the Arctic, and especially if you look at maybe at the United States, where it's really only Alaska, and so it certainly is not a decisive moment of the overall politics of the country, and I think that can be seen for many of the Arctic countries. So do you think when you talk about Arctic diplomacy or politics, do you think that there is sometimes the risk for these Arctic countries that other interests of these countries overtake the interests of the Arctic, and especially of the people and the environment in the Arctic?
I think this is ultimately a risk in international politics in general. Every state has multiple interests that it has to balance at the same time. With some states, such as the United States, who has so many different things on its plate at any given moment, the fact that the Arctic has become, or traditionally is, a minor subject in its political discourse is perhaps not so much a reflection of the Arctic, but a reflection of the fact that Alaska, because of a combination of its isolation, its relative newness, and the fact that it is in an area where politics is relatively stable. The Arctic region is not known for being a high conflict area in the past 20 years, certainly not since the end of the Cold War. And as a result, it wouldn't be surprising that sometimes the Arctic is more important on any political agenda versus other times. I think you would find this in any state, whether you are an Arctic state or not. The fact that, particularly in the Arctic region, that Indigenous peoples oftentimes have direct means of self-representation, such as in the Arctic Council, this really helps to give them the means and for them to push for their agendas to be heard, both on an international and on a national stage. So ultimately, I don't think that is necessarily an issue that the Arctic states themselves deal with. All states deal with the issue that they are balancing multiple issues at any given time. And sometimes some issues, such as the Arctic or any other region of the world, become more prominent issues on a political agenda at one given time versus another.
Excellent. And now, of course, the question is, you say at one given time or another, they might become more relevant. And my question is, with the changing environment in the Arctic, especially linked to climate change, do you see in the future more international attention to the Arctic in the future? And also, as a follow-up to that, do you see more potential for collaboration among the Arctic nations and other nations maybe too? Or do you see this actually more undermining the collaborative efforts? So I hope you could hear me, because Danita, I could not hear you now. So in case you dropped out of the call, I want to say, if you don't come back in the next few seconds, I will just say thank you, Danita. I think the last question, we can leave that open for future discussions and future conversations. We will continue both having recorded interviews like this one and also live sessions, including question and answer sessions on the Arctic Summer College. I want to say special thanks to Danita Burke, who made it possible for us to have this interview recorded from her summer school in the Welsh language for the Arctic Summer College. So one summer school supporting the other. Excellent. And thank you so much for all your insights regarding the Arctic and your research in the Arctic. And I think,
Hello,
Danita,
my apologies.
yes, you're
my
back.
my internet.
I already said a lengthy thank you message.
Oh.
So I think we can wrap it up here if you just want to say goodbye. And then I also told people that they can continue the conversation and send you questions and continue later on online. So thank you so much. And I hope it was
No
fun
problem.
for
Thank
you
you for
as
having
well.
me.
Well, thank you.
Thank you
And
very
we'll be in
much.
touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.